Today, we will delve into the narratives and cultural threads that are being threatened in our homes and that compel us to confront the profound impact of climate change on health. This is what is really at stake. I'll have Tess start with her story.
All right, so as Caleb just said, we are all emergency physicians and climate and health fellows, but come from different places and want to share our stories of how climate change has impacted the health of our communities, but also how that impacts culture and how that affects the health. I come from rural Canada and want to share a little bit about that and that story. I have some slides, but I don't know if we'll be able to share them with some pictures, but if we can't, that's fine. Okay. Yes. Perfect. Thank you. What we want to get with these stories is to see how there are, although we are from very disparate backgrounds, how there's similarities between the stories and how those similarities are what unite us and unite us in our fight against climate change and health. So we'll go to the next slide. And these are all images I've taken from across Canada. And these are images from everywhere from the Yukon to the Rocky Mountains, to the Maritimes, and to our lakes. And we all know that Canada is the second largest country in the world. It also has the longest coastline in the world, from the Pacific to Atlantic and the Arctic. And it has a range of different geographies. And these include the ice and permafrost of the Arctic. It includes the mountain ranges like the Rockies. It includes all these coastlines and coastal communities. It includes a large amount of forest, including spruce, poplar, and pine, and then lakes that contain much of the world's fresh water. And across all of these different geographies are different cultures and communities, from Indigenous people, First Nations, Métis, and Inuits, as well as the French and British colonized, as well as other immigrants over time. We also know that Canada, given its northern location, is warming at twice the rate of the rest of the world. And we know that these are causing changes to the climate around us, including the Arctic, the sea ice is decreasing. We're seeing melting of the permafrost. In the oceans, we're seeing sea level rise. We're seeing changes in the acidity, and we're seeing decreased oxygenation. We're seeing changes in the forest ecosystems, and we're seeing changes in extreme weather with increasing frequency and severity of extreme weather events, from heat waves, drought, and precipitation to wildfires. And wildfires are really what got me into this space, as I saw my friends and family affected by wildfires, and in particular saw how it's changed over my lifetime even, where we're seeing increasing length of the fire season, we're getting more exposure to smoke, and we're seeing these impacts on the community. And this is what brought me into the work I'm doing now in climate change and health, seeing these impacts on my friends and family, and also on my patients. And I'm working now looking at medically vulnerable communities and how they're impacted by wildfires. So we know that climate change has direct and indirect impacts on health. We know that these impacts are unequal and that they perpetuate health disparities. And this happens within our Indigenous communities, in our communities of color, of low wealth, and in rural areas like areas I'm from. We know these have less resources, including human and financial, and they depend more on natural processes and ecosystems for lives and livelihoods. In Canada, they comprise about 79% of the land and 6 million Canadians. This is one image of what heat is doing to communities. So these are pictures from Lytton in British Columbia. You might have remembered the heat wave in summer of 2021. We know that certain communities are less prepared, in particular ones that are not normally affected by these hazards, Canada being one of them. And this community had record-breaking temperatures to over 49 degrees Celsius multiple days in a row. And this contributed to wildfires affecting the community afterwards. And you can see, these are my images of the forest and the houses that are broken down, and then one of the smoke from the last summer when I was up in Canada. And we know that during this heat wave, there were 800 deaths in Western Canada, but we also know it affected infrastructure. And we know that there's longer term effects of this heat wave as well. And we also know that the wildfire itself caused evacuation of basically the whole community, leading to 2 deaths. But also all these other impacts we're getting are going to cause longer lasting effects and a longer tail of morbidity and mortality afterwards from these interruptions in care. And those are really the things that interest me in what's happening. And we know that this is also affecting community and culture as people are forced out of their homes and have to rebuild this. And we really want to think about more these long-term impacts. We know that there's not just heat, we know there's extreme weather and floods. We know last year that there were some of the worst flooding events in the Northwest Territories. And again, this is causing many to evacuate and causing these interruptions to their care and their community. We also know that the warming and sea ice is changing transportation systems, particularly in the Arctic, and this can lead to injury and death. We also are seeing with the changing climate, we're seeing less access to healthy food and clean water. The changes in precipitation are causing contamination to the water, and this is leading to people potentially choosing foods that are not their native foods, not the local foods, and getting store-bought foods, particularly in Indigenous communities. And we know this leads to many different health effects, from lack of nutrition to obesity and diabetes. We know all of these have different impacts on mental health. And as we lose our communities, as we have to evacuate, we know that this impacts our mental health, and we know there's long-term impacts of mental health, and that changes in livelihoods will also impact this as you no longer can stay in your community. So I want to talk a little bit about the strengths as well of communities and the cultures we have. And so although rural communities may be more impacted, there's also a strength that comes from a culture and connection to the lands. And there are certain things that people have been doing to improve the strength of their community. This includes everything from creating wind farms in British Columbia to sharing Indigenous knowledge and flexible resource use, and sharing intergenerational knowledge to think about changing in hunting practices as ecosystems change, and to use place-based knowledge to adapt to these impacts of climate change and preserve community. And I think what we want to think here is how we use these strengths of the communities we're in to mitigate the climate risks to health, and how we can then preserve community and preserve culture, and therefore decrease the risk to health.
Thank you, Tess. Lots to unpack there. Climate is changing, it's impacting our health, it's impacting culture. Culture may be part of the solution as well, to how to learn to live in this situation. We're going to turn our attention a little bit further south in the Americas now. So if we're ready to play one of the videos, we can start that right now.
My name is Catarina Jutsi, and I'm from the beautiful tropical country of Brazil. I spent my formative years in the rural region of southeastern Brazil, where winter festivities celebrated rural life and marked the end of the rainy season with our traditional Festa Junina. Come January, the summer months brought us together along the coastline, where we adorned the ocean with flowers in gratitude to Iemanjá, the goddess of the sea, for a bountiful year. Yet, attempting to encapsulate Brazil's rich culture solely through my personal experience would be a big oversight. I take immense pride in the unimaginable breadth of cultural backgrounds, traditions, religions, and folklore that collectively form our cultural tapestry. From the vibrant riverside culture that flourished along the Amazon, honoring the pink dolphins and other mystical creatures, to the Afro influences shaping the powerful music, dances, and colors of the Northeast, and the cowboy culture of the diligent men and women in the cattle ranching South. As I grew up, I witnessed the profound connection Brazilians had with their land and their cultural identity. Now, as a doctor, I ponder on the looming threat of this diversity, the threat of climate change on health, and on our ultimate ability to preserve our cultural threads. Heat waves are impacting communities throughout the country, leading to a continuous rise in heat-related deaths, particularly among the elderly and vulnerable populations. Just last month, Brazil recorded its highest temperature in history. Hospitalizations are increasing due to heat-related or exacerbated illnesses such as heart disease, asthma, kidney disease, and mental health conditions. Despite our historically abundant water supply, more intense and prolonged droughts are causing crop losses and food insecurity across the country. Coupled with deforestation, these drought conditions are rendering parts of the Amazon and Pantanal wetlands more susceptible to fires further exposing communities to direct and indirect health impacts of smoke and air pollution. The complex interplay between climate change and deforestation, urbanization, and population shifts is altering the historical distribution of vector-borne diseases like malaria, dengue, and Zika. Dengue transmission suitability has increased and reached a new peak, and its geographical distribution has reached higher latitudes and less populated areas. In some parts of the country, climate change is making extreme precipitation more likely. Just a year ago, rain killed 200 people in the city of Petropolis, one of the deadliest in the city's history. Deadly mudslides in various communities underscore the profound infrastructural vulnerabilities exacerbated by climate instability and extreme rainfall, particularly in informal communities and favelas. No one quite knows what the future holds. I'm afraid, however, that climate-exacerbated heat waves, extreme precipitation, drought, and wildfires will continue to harm the health of communities throughout. It is my hope that communities will find the opportunity to rebuild and restore their narratives. I fear, though, that some areas already face the harsh reality of becoming uninhabitable. According to the Internal Displacement Monitoring Center, Brazil leads the Americas in the number of internally displaced individuals, close to 750,000 people who lost their homes and livelihoods due to natural disasters. In the Amazon, fire, drought, land degradation, and erosion are disrupting the livelihood, health, and food security of indigenous groups and traditional riverside communities. These communities, which have co-evolved with the land and water for generations, are now becoming displaced and being forced to relocate to unfamiliar regions away from their ancestral connections. How will heat and precipitation change agricultural practices and the intimate relationship between communities and their land? How will sea level rise continue to eat away fishing communities like it already has in some parts of the country? Will urban flooding and deadly mudslides force neighborhoods and communities to diverge from their shared stories? Will drying rivers and loss of flora and fauna continue to remove people from their traditional ways of life? As we continue to quantify the health impacts of climate change and adapt our healthcare system, I hope we keep stories and traditions as the forefront of why we fight for health. I hope that we don't just express the numbers of displaced or harmed, but also remember the stories behind those numbers, and hopefully preserve a future generation's chance of offering their own flower to Iemanjá. Thank you.
So I think in the interest of time, we're going to move to the third video and hear from another setting that's profoundly impacted by climate change. Sea level rise, tropical cyclones, the Americas, we call them hurricanes, are a huge issue. And we're going to hear from a third physician who's lived that experience, has cared for patients in the aftermath, and has a lot to share on what it means to live that experience and then go on living that experience as part of a community that is facing inexorably escalating hazards to their homes, to their livelihoods, and to simple things, or what should be simple things, like being able to go to the doctor's office. So we can play that third video.
Hello, I'm Latoya Storr, and I am from the Commonwealth of the Bahamas. The Caribbean is a region located between the coasts of North and South America and consists of the Caribbean Sea, its islands, and the surrounding coasts. It is composed of roughly 30 countries and territories with a population of over 44 million. It is known for its picturesque landscapes of turquoise waters, lush foliage, vibrant, colorful architecture, and diverse ecosystems. The climate is tropical with a distinct wet and dry season. It is a melting pot of cultures reflecting the influences of indigenous peoples, European colonialization, African heritage, and South Asian and Southeast Asian migration during the 19th century. This amalgamation of cultures has given birth to rich cuisines that utilize the resources of the region and world-renowned genres of music such as calypso and soca, reggae, and salsa. It is also one of the world's most vulnerable regions to climate change, most notably sea level rise and tropical cyclones. As a Bahamian, I grew up preparing every year for hurricane season. As an emergency physician, I have worked in hospitals during many hurricane duties. Having worked through the aftermath of Hurricane Dorian in 2019, the worst storm in the country's history, I was motivated to improve healthcare systems, disaster preparedness and response, and climate change adaptation in the country and the region. Climate change poses a significant and multifaceted threat to the health of individuals in the Caribbean. Rising temperatures, coastline erosion, and changing weather patterns contribute to a range of health challenges. Increase in heat-related illnesses, particularly in vulnerable populations such as the elderly and those with pre-existing health conditions such as hypertension and diabetes, which are leading healthcare concerns in the region. Prolonged heat waves can exacerbate cardiovascular and respiratory conditions. Climate change patterns have seen an increase in favorable conditions for vector-borne diseases like dengue and Zika viruses. This year has recorded the warmest sea surface temperatures in recent history, which contributes to the proliferation of harmful algal blooms, which has the potential to increase the incidence of diseases related to contaminated seafood consumption. Extreme storms bring about not only physical injuries, but the disruption to power sources and damage to healthcare facilities, leading to persons being unable to access care, which can worsen pre-existing conditions. Rising sea levels make storm surges more severe to allow for saltwater intrusion into water tables, greatly impacting a community's ability to access proper drinking water, thereby significantly impacting health. Acute displacement from extreme weather events results in overcrowding living conditions, difficulty accessing clean water, and compromised sanitation, which significantly increases the risk of infectious diseases. The trauma experienced during and after such disasters can lead to a rise in anxiety, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder in both survivors and responders, and require a multidisciplinary approach that includes mental health support. Future impacts on climate change on the Caribbean region will affect both the environment and the cultural fabric of the islands. The region's rich biodiversity, including coral reefs and marine life, has been impacted by coral bleaching, a consequence of warming sea temperatures. Continued warming poses a significant threat to this diverse ecosystem, which is vital to many economies through fishing and tourism, and impacts the cultural identity of many Caribbean communities. Changes in temperature and precipitation patterns can disrupt traditional agricultural practices, affecting staple crops, as well as shipping supply chains, which has implications for food security and can lead to changes in dietary habits and cultural practices related to food. Climate change poses a threat to the preservation of cultural heritage sites, acts, and traditions. Rising sea levels, more intense storms, and changing environmental conditions can damage or destroy structures and objects that hold historical and cultural significance, as many are located along coastlines. The increasing frequency of extreme weather events and the gradual loss of habitable land due to sea level rise may force communities to migrate, which is a fear of many in the region. This can result in the displacement of people, leading to the potential loss of unique cultural traditions and practices. Forced migration from one's native home will have a significant impact on mental health in current and future generations. Collaborative efforts, informed policies, and community engagement are essential for building resilience and mitigating the consequences of climate change in the Caribbean. Thank you.
I'll just share a few final words of us coming together. And I'm so glad we were able to see the amazing stories of my co-fellows. And I hope from these, we were able to see how the impacts of climate change are affecting communities and their health and their culture around different areas of the Americas. What we need to do now is we must come together, and we have 3 tasks we want to think about. One is that we need to call for mitigation, because every degree of warming that we avoid is going to translate into saved lives. Despite our efforts for mitigation, however, we know the effects of climate change are already happening. And therefore, number two is we need to look at how to become resilient with our communities and adapt at all levels of healthcare delivery, from communities to hospitals to healthcare systems. If we don't prepare, we are preparing to fail. Finally, as we increasingly rely on objective data to qualify the impacts of climate change on health and communicate the impacts, we need to bear in mind the other metrics we are striving to protect, the fundamental human need to find meaning through memories, stories, and cultural connections. Thank you.